Hello again. I haven't made a video in a while, but I thought I'd make one today as a follow-up to a lesson I had with a student. This is going to be a game played by Milo, who I think was featured in an earlier student game playing in the World Open. In this case, he was playing in Worcester this last Thursday, and I forget what he's rated now, but his opponent was rated almost 2,000, or a little bit over 2,000, so it was going to be quite a challenge for him. Milo had white, and his opponent had black, obviously. Milo led with d4, black played f5, and this is a defense called the Dutch defense. c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6. And there are some important things to know about the Dutch. One is that it's an opening black can use to try to get counter-attacking chances, to get a double-edged position against someone black has to win against. So it's a good kind of weapon to use against a player lower rated than you are. It has the downside, though, that it involves moving the f-pawn to f5. And as I've said in the past, that can really weaken the black king, especially if black castles kingside. Milo played bishop f4, and this is an interesting move. The bishop could have gone to g5 instead. Milo's idea is that he wants to play e2, e3, but he doesn't want to block the bishop inside the pawn chain. So he brings it out first, and he chose the f4 square. One of the variations of the Dutch defense is called the stone wall, and it involves putting pawns on f5, e6, and d5. And against that setup, the bishop belongs on f4, and that's because when black creates a very strong central pawn structure on the light squares, the dark squares become weak, and this h2, b8 diagonal becomes very important. Black ends up with his dark squared bishop being his best piece, and he really wants to, but only if he can put that bishop on that diagonal, by playing bishop to d6 at some point. So by having the bishop on f4 against the stone wall, white makes it so that black's dark squared bishop either will be nowhere near as good as it would have been otherwise, or it will be traded off. Okay, but Alonso, who was Milo's opponent, did not play the stone wall. He played d6. And it's clear that black intends to play the move e5 at some point. And if he can get that move in, suddenly black's center may be bigger than white's, and he'll even be playing the move with tempo because there's a bishop on f4. Knight f3 from Milo, putting extra protection on e5, continuing to get developed. Obvious and good move, I think. Bishop to e7, e3, castle kingside, and bishop e2. And I criticized Milo a little bit for playing bishop e2, because in my experience against the Dutch, this bishop goes to d3. And as a general idea, if black doesn't have the opportunity to put a bishop on g4, pinning the kingside knight to the queen, it's almost always right to put this light-squared bishop on d3. Okay, I'm sure you can find plenty of counter-examples, but that's chess. Bishop to e2, knight e4. Yeah, and this is a common kind of move in the Dutch. By playing f5, black is giving himself more control over e4, and it's natural for him at some point to want to occupy that square with his kingside knight. Here, though, I wish Milo had simply captured the knight. Knight takes e4, f takes e4, and then retreated his knight to d2. And he told me, while we were talking today, that he looked at this line, but he thought that after black's d5, defending the e4 pawn, the change in the position favored black. I disagree with him, though, because after knight d2, black has no way to defend the e4 pawn except with d5. And once d5 is played, we've transposed into a stonewall pawn structure in which black is captured back on e4. And a transposition into that structure justifies the position of the bishop on f4 because it is now on the most important dark square diagonal. And it looks a little bit scary to see black's pawn on e4 taking up all this space, but white will quickly castle kingside and at some point play f3, removing black's e4 pawn, equalizing the space in the center, and leaving himself hopefully able to exploit this weak e5 square. But Milo played queen c2. And Alonso played knight takes c3. Now there's something else to realize here, which is that black at least has the possibility at his disposal of playing g5, and after white's dark squared bishop retreats to g3, playing f4, trapping the bishop. But an interesting thing about the Dutch is that you can sometimes even lose your dark squared bishop as white on the king side to a pawn storm like that and still have an equal position, just because in order to get the piece, black has to expose his king even more. And that's sort of what happened in this game. Alonso played knight takes c3, and in light of what follows, I think Milo should have played b takes c3, opening the b file for his rook and keeping his queen on the same diagonal as the h7 pawn. But Milo played queen takes c3, and now Alonso went ahead and won a piece with g5, bishop g3, f4. Milo traded, removing one of the pawns in front of the black king. It's a good idea. And now there's no way to save this bishop on g3, but notice that once black takes it, white will retake with the h-pawn, opening up his rook against the h7 square, and he has two pieces able to function on light square diagonals, and so he'll end up with three pieces combining in an attack on h7. And despite the fact that black's up a piece, he's going to have to be very careful, or he could get checkmated. Milo played queen c2, and this is a good demonstration of the fact that it was probably better to take back with the b-pawn on c3. Alonso played e5, and this is probably not a very good move. When you are under attack and your king is lacking cover, what you usually want to do is, and you have an extra piece, what you usually want to do is cause your pieces to kind of swarm over toward your king and cover him up. What you don't want to do is open new lines against your king, and that's what black does here. By playing e5, which allows d takes e5, did Milo play that immediately? No, sorry, after e5 he played bishop d3. But at some point white's going to capture on e5, and this simply opens more diagonal lines toward the black king. Alonso played rook to f7, d takes e5, and notice now that when black takes back on e5, not only can that pawn be captured by the white knight, but white probably intends to castle queenside, putting a rook on the d file, basically with tempo against the black queen, because bishop takes h7 check is threatened. Alonso took the piece on g3, and okay, black is now up a piece, but after h takes g3, white has a very powerful attack. The h7 square is attacked 3 times and defended twice, and it's impossible for black to defend it again on his following move. It's also impossible to cause it to be defended by advancing it, as the h6 and h5 squares are both completely undefended. Alonso played rook g7, giving his king the f7 square as an escape square. Milo took on h7, of course, with check. Alonso played king f7. And I think it's not too hard to tell at this point that the black king's in big trouble. White's down a piece, but given that the h-pawn is no longer on the board, white now has 3 pawns for the piece, and they're all passed. So even if white can't find a way to checkmate black here or win material, he's going to be in at least an okay position, let's say, or a position that is not necessarily winning for black if he goes to an endgame. Yeah, and here Milo played rook h6, the first of a series of very strong, what I call quiet moves. A quiet move is a move which is not a check, a capture, a structure-changing pawn move, or something super obvious like the doubling of a rook. Milo's idea here is that from h6, the rook adds protection to g6, which will allow maybe a bishop g6 check at some point, and that may win him the game. Alonso played bishop to g5, stopping white from castling queenside and putting pressure on this rook on h6. And here, white is completely winning, but of course, as is often the case in these positions, he has to find some series of moves that wins tactically. And here was his first, maybe, opportunity to win the game on the spot. White can play rook to g6. And the idea here is that black's bishop on g5 is being attacked twice and cannot be defended a second time, which means black will likely have to retreat this bishop to e7, at which point white may just take on g7, followed by playing queen g6 check, followed by castling queenside, and let me give you an example. Bishop to e7, for example, rook g7, king g7, queen g6, and now if king f8, queen g8 is checkmate. So king h8, and white may just play castle queenside here, and then rook h1, and it's hard to imagine that black is escaping this. And black also cannot take the rook on g6, because after rook takes g6, queen takes g6 check. I'm sure there's checkmate here, but at the very least, the bishop on g5 is about to be captured, and that will introduce a new piece to the attack, and white still has castle queenside and rook h1, and is completely winning. But Milo chose to play not rook g6, but bishop g6 check. And this is not the move I would have played, but a nice thing, as I often say about these tactically winning, these totally overwhelming winning positions, is that usually you don't have to see the first tactic. You can play a move that doesn't lose, and on your following move you'll still be winning. And here Milo finds the second of his nice quiet moves. He plays, after king g8, he plays rook h5. And the idea here is similar to the idea behind rook g6. The bishop on g5 is under attack twice and cannot be defended again. And the bishop on g6, of course, is guarded by the queen. Alonso has no choice but to play bishop to e7, and here Milo castles queenside. D takes e5 is no longer possible because it would hang the queen on d8, and white simply intends rook d to h1 and rook h8 checkmate. Bishop to g4. Alrighty, and of course Alonso is hitting this rook on h5 and would love to remove an attacker from the board, but Milo plays another nice quiet move, rook h2, simply getting out of the way because he realizes that there's nothing black can do against the threat of rook d to h1. Bishop to g5 is a check, and though it would be a bad idea for white to play knight takes g5, when queen takes g5, we'll grab this bishop on g6, white has simply king b1. Knight to d7 from black. I mean, it doesn't solve black's problems, but black did not have a way to do that. So knight d7 at least develops a piece. White plays rook d to h1 and is immediately threatening checkmate, and rook takes g6 doesn't do much to get out of the checkmate. As you can imagine, two rooks and a queen against the black king is not much of a contest. So black's only move is king f8. Rook h8 check is a natural follow-up. Black's only move that doesn't drop the queen is rook to g8. Alright, and now we have a second opportunity for Milo to win the game tactically. What I think he should have played is rook takes g8 check, king takes g8, and now this interesting looking bishop f7 check. The idea is, of course, that if black avoids taking the bishop, rook h8 check will win the queen, or something showing up on h7 will show up there with devastating effect. So black will likely take this bishop on f7, and then after rook to h7 check, if the king goes back to e8 or f8, there will either be a checkmate, or white will simply win the queen with rook h8 check. Okay, that's a little bit iffy because black has quite a bit of material for the queen, but there should be a checkmate there. And let's see, should the black king come to, pardon me, after rook h7 check, should the black king come to e6, there's queen g6 check. And for example, after knight f6, there's knight takes g5 check. White is regaining his material, and you can imagine that with the black king sitting on e6 and having to move again, black is not long for this world. Actually, after king takes e5, there's immediately knight f7 check, and black loses the queen. And if bishop to f6, there's still this knight g5 check. King takes e5, and now there's queen e4 checkmate. And if the king retreats to g8, there is a checkmate with queen g6 and queen f7. Actually, that's true after king e8 as well. Okay, anyway, getting back to the game. Milo did not find this tactic, so after rook g8 he played queen e4. But this is another nice quiet move. White has many of his pieces involved in the attack. Even his knight is involved, threatening to remove a defender with knight takes g5 or to assist in the winning of a piece the same way. So white plays queen e4, bringing a last piece into the game, and introducing the idea at some point of putting the queen on d5, possibly with check after capturing on g8. Black played knight takes e5, and here we have a third opportunity for white to win the game with tactics. Rook takes g8 check, king takes g8, queen to d5 check. Nothing can be put in between the queen and the king safely, so the black king must move. King to f8 will allow rook h8 if nothing else. So king g7, threatening the bishop on g6, and white can't currently play queen f7 checkmate because of the knight, and white deals with both of those things by playing knight takes e5, protecting the bishop on g6 and threatening queen f7. White is winning here. But instead, Milo took directly on e5, and this is understandable because after d takes e5, queen takes g4, white is up 2 pawns. On top of that, all of the heavy pieces are left on the board, with bishops of opposite color and an exposed black king. And that should mean that this is an easy win for white. But after Alonso's queen f6, Milo made a major strategic error. He played queen to f5, allowing the trade of queens. So what should he have done instead? One idea is to capture on g8, and once the black king takes back, maybe to play queen h5. Maybe another idea is to play queen h5 immediately. But perhaps the best idea is simply to retreat the light squared bishop with, for example, bishop to c2. And that takes care of the threat of queen takes g6. And we just have white having played another quiet move, and will soon demonstrate to black that the fact that they are bishops of opposite color and heavy pieces and an exposed black king means that white will win the game. As I said, what Milo actually played is queen f5, and this allows the trade of queens, which gives black chances to escape into a bishops of opposite color endgame and possibly draw. Alonso played rook d8. I think if I were him, I would have immediately captured on f5. Why give white the chance to take back that move? Queen takes f5, bishop takes f5, and then rook d8 is what I was looking at during the game. Rook d8, queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook g8, king g8, and bishop e4. And as I pointed out to Milo, maybe there's one more chance to try to hold on to a somewhat significant advantage here with king c2. Just trying to stop the black rook from showing up on d2 and eating a bunch of white pawns. Black can re-enable rook d2 with bishop g5, but now that the king's on c2, white could, if he had to, play rook d1. And though this allows the trade of rooks, the last set of heavy pieces, white would have winning chances with his extra couple of pawns on the king side. But Milo played bishop e4 instead, and this allows rook d2. And I'd say by this point, white's winning chances are vanishing. Milo played bishop takes b7, and after rook takes f2, it's pretty clear that the extra of these two doubled pawns doesn't mean much. Rook to d1, trying to activate his pieces. e4, nice move by black, which gives up the e-pawn, but wins the b-pawn and the a-pawn, because if white goes to the corner here, rook to d2 is check, winning the rook on d1. So king c1, rook takes a2, and this position is completely equal. Yes, white has an extra pawn, but it's doubled, and we have bishops of opposite color. There's really no hope to win this. White will never be able to control the dark squares enough to get his pawns all the way up the board. Rook to d7, bishop to e5, bishop d5 check. Okay, the white pieces are active, but there aren't enough of them. King f8, g4, rook f2, g5. During the game, I thought I saw some reason that bishop f4 did not immediately win the g5 pawn. What was that reason? Oh, maybe it's just that it allows rook takes c7, and now white has two passed pawns and therefore better winning chances than he did a moment ago. Okay, so after g5, black played a5, looking for counterplay with his a-pawn. Very smart idea. White played g6, a4, and here Milo played rook f7 check, which has the effect of straightening out his pawn structure after rook takes f7, g takes f7. But unfortunately, with this pawn on a light square, black already has a blockade. White simply will never be able to control the g7 square enough to advance his g-pawn to g7. And we'll see that shortly. c5, g4, a3, king b1, bishop d4, king a2. And black now defends the pawn with bishop b2, but actually doesn't even need to. As long as he doesn't give up both of these pawns, it's not very difficult for him to draw. g5. And I think at this point Alonso made a move and offered a draw, and Milo accepted. So yeah, great game by my student. I think he's rated around 1600, so this draw was a very nice upset, and the win would, of course, have been an even nicer one. He's been playing really well recently. He beat someone rated 1750 who spent a lot of time in Class A, and Alonso has spent a lot of time in the expert category, I think. So Milo's really making progress. I especially like all the quiet moves he found during the game. I think that shows that he's becoming a stronger player. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. Milo, I hope that was helpful. I think I said I was going to show your other game as well, but I'll just show this one. All right, thanks. Bye.